Today we're going to talk about Albrecht Dürer in his famous owl paintings. We'll be inspired by him and draw our own owls. You're going to start by making two large circles on your paper. The space between the circle should be approximately the same size of the circle itself. Then comes the beak. The beak isn't too far beneath the eyes. You want to put it pretty much right in between, and it's kind of like a diamond shape. There's a top upside down V, and then a larger V for the bottom of the beak. Now I'm going to sketch around really lightly to make the outline of his head, which is kind of like an oval. Then I'm going to make the beginning of the body, and I'm going to kind of let it go off the edge of the paper. Now I'm going to make the horns of the great horned owl. They aren't actually horns. They're just feathers that mimic the shape of a horn. And I'm putting that in really lightly. We'll add to it later. Now we're going to mix value. Start by choosing a color and putting some water and swishing. Fill in the medium value. Usually you use medium when you're painting. Now we're going to try to get a medium light. I'm adding white to the wet paint, and you can see that it lightens. Now I'm going to paint my light area without adding more paint. Now if that's too dark, I simply dry off my brush and use the brush to soak up that extra paint. To do medium dark, I'm swirling my paintbrush without adding extra water. And with dark, I stir it even more without much water. And you can see that I get a much deeper color. It's all dependent on the quantity of water you use. Now we're going to try different varieties of line. With the tip of my regular paintbrush, I'm filling in the 3 section. This is a medium line. Now I'm going to make it slightly thicker by pressing my brush down just the slightest bit more. Now for my thickest line, I'm almost laying my brush down across the paper. For the last 2, I'm going to switch to a smaller paintbrush. I'm very lightly just tickling the paper to get a tiny thin line. And then to get a medium thin, I'm just pressing it down a tad bit more. Finally, we're going to play with direction of line. Vertical lines are lines that go up and down. I want you to make thin vertical lines. Then diagonal. From one side of the box to the other, nice and thin. And finally, horizontal lines. They look like they're laying down for a nap. You're going to fill it with thin horizontal lines. Now, we want to use the lightest value, that 1 value, to fill our owl. In a couple of spots, you might wind up with a 2 value, but for the most part, your entire owl is going to be full of that very light value. You may choose to use colors that an owl actually is, or you could use blues and purples. After all, this is a piece of art, so you're able to make your own color choices as the artist. Now I need to let my art dry for a bit. I'm going to use a Sharpie marker to outline my eyes and color the pupil of the eye in. This is a little bit more controlled than using watercolor. I'm tracing around the eye, and then I'll move to the other one, trying to make it symmetrical, essentially the same on both sides. I can make little light spots on the eye where maybe the light is hitting, a little glimmer in the eye. And the same thing goes for the beak. If I want to make a couple light spots where maybe the light is hitting that beautiful shiny beak, I can trace around them to make sort of like rectangles on the beak. And now I'm going to fill around that and just leave those spots white. Now I'm going to add texture using both of the paintbrushes you've been given. And I'm paying very close attention to the direction that the feathers are moving, and I'm using a 3 or 4 or 5 value. So I'm looking around the eyes, and those are in a radial pattern. So with the thinnest line, I'm going around the eyes in a symmetrical fashion. If you do this too thick, it won't look like feathers. It'll look more like crazy eyelashes, and you definitely don't want that on your owl. The next thing I'm going to do is get in between the beak. The feathers there move vertically, so I'm going up in a different direction to get the feathers. Now I'm using a larger brush to get those horns. Again, I can use the color that they actually are, or I can use a creative color. Now I'm going to go around the outline of my owl. I'm simply making lines that mimic the texture. The thinner the line, the better. As I move around the body, I want them to follow the direction of the body, almost diagonal. I can trace around where the wings might be and add a few feathers in the chest area. Now I'm going to use a larger brush. When you do this, you want to get most of the paint off before you work on your owl. So you can see there's hardly any paint on my brush, and I'm getting a really nice feathery texture. I got this by painting on another surface before touching my good paper. When you run out of paint, you simply load back up and paint on a surface that you don't care about right here. And when you start to see lines, then you know you're ready to move from your scrap paper to your actual owl. There we go, looking good. Now I can add a little bit of white if I thought I've lost some of the detail in the horn area, or maybe I'll add some thin feathers on top. Next up is the eyes. I'm using yellow watercolor to fill in the entire eye around the pupil. Then, while it's still wet, I'm taking orange and I'm tracing around the outside of the eye. This is called wet on wet. The paint kind of bleeds, and in this case, it makes an effect that really works well to show an owl's eyes. It'll fade from yellow to orange, which is perfect. Now for the background, I'm going to use paint sticks to make circles. Paint sticks are water soluble, so I can add water and spread them, and it makes almost like a sky effect. You do need to be incredibly careful not to go back over your owl. Watercolor paint can be reawakened, so if you go onto it, it will spread. But when you're done, as long as you followed directions and tried your best, you're going to have an awesome owl. You can see these here were done by students, and yours will look just as beautiful